Obviously, if we take a step back sort of 3 weeks ago, we wouldn't have been talking, or we wouldn't have thought we'd be talking about a cut today, because as you said, it's not the norm for them to be going meeting after meeting, and it felt like that they would be sort of skipping this meeting and moving on to December. So I think it's going to be a lot of questions as to what's driven them to make this cut. And, obviously we've seen weaker PMIs, we've seen the inflation data be a bit soggier than they would like, and year over year now sub 2%. But I think there'll be questions around that. But I think maybe even more importantly is, what does the future look like? And then we're going to be going into the realms of what happened earlier this year, where obviously the ECB did pre-announce a cut, and it proved to possibly be the wrong decision at the time. So I do think Christine Lagarde's going to want to try to distance herself from absolutely fully committing to December. We've just seen a 50 bps from the Fed, and maybe there's question marks as to whether that was right given the data we've seen since. So I think that's really going to be the dynamic that is going to be most interesting for me, is what sort of level of commitment do we get going forward from Lagarde.
The commentary has been fascinating from the Governing Council members, in the sense that, as you say, they were so willing to commit to that first rate reduction. But when I spoke to a lot of them, they really were not willing to commit to anything after that. There was about one member at the time who's willing to provide some guidance, but the rest were saying, look, it's impossible to tell what's going to come down the track. But now, as we look at a much weaker profile in Europe, particularly in the powerhouse of Germany, how important is that going to be, even for the likes of the Bundesbank, as they look at the dynamics across the euro area?
It's obviously hugely important, because that's obviously what has shifted this thinking over the last couple of weeks or so. I still think they are going to possibly have a bit of reticence around fully committing to it, just given what's happened previously and also what's happening in the US at the moment. But you're completely right. We are seeing weakness in the Eurozone. It does deserve at the moment to be on a path of continual cutting. So I think that's absolutely fair. So it's going to be really interesting how she, maybe not dodges the question, but how she goes around answering that question, because obviously the press are going to be all over that.
The US story is very interesting, isn't it, and what bearing it has on this meeting, because it felt as though there was a lot of cover that the Federal Reserve managed to buy for central banks around the world with that 50 basis point reduction, only for some of that to be really taken back in following weeks as we saw some hot data. So what bearing do you think that US reduction has really had on central banks like the ECB?
It's definitely given them a little bit of leeway. Obviously, the ECB, as the Bank of England, other central banks had already gone before the Fed decided. I think the Fed then had the ability to do 50 basis points, which is why I don't think we're going to be anywhere near contemplating a 50 from the ECB today, given that they've already started their journey. But I do feel it gives them a bit more air cover. The biggest central bank in the world, obviously that has an impact on the dollar. They're easing policy. That means that the ECB has the confidence to go. But really, the ECB and Lagarde is going to say, we're looking at the domestic data, and you're completely right. The powerhouse of Germany is struggling. Inflation's coming down a bit faster than they thought. They believe they're restrictive. I think that's really important. This isn't them going from accommodative policy to even further accommodative policy. This is going from what they perceive to be very restrictive policy to slightly less restrictive, taking their foot off the brake. That's how I think they will frame this.